A writer tells us of a dream she had once. As a matter of fact, it was a recurring dream that came back to her again and again. In her dream, she visited hell. To her surprise, there was no fire there, and there were no horrific scenes of torture or of suffering. There in hell, she was led along a labyrinth of dark, dank passages from which there were many doors leading to a number of cells. It was not like the hell she had pictured at all. In fact, to her surprise, it seemed rather religious and churchy. Each cell was identical, and in the center of each one of those cells there was an altar. And before each altar, there knelt this sickly, weak, greeny, gray, ghostly figure steeped in prayer and adoration. The writer turned to her guide and asked, "Who are they worshiping?" "Themselves," was all the guide said. Themselves. This is pure self-worship, the guide went on to say. They are feeding on themselves and on their own spirituality in a kind of auto-spiritual cannibalism. This is why they look so sickly and emaciated. They're only feeding on themselves. The writer was appalled and saddened by the whole scene, by these rows and rows of cells with their non-communicating inmates spending eternity in solitary confinement, putting their own self first and last, and the only object of their worship. They were worshiping themselves. In first century Palestine, the Pharisee positioned themselves as the great keepers of the rules. They were the ones who kept and enforced the rules. And God help you if you break the rules. They put themselves separate and above the others who did not keep the rules. And they were held in quite high esteem, actually, by the Jewish masses. Tax collectors, on the other hand, were Jews who worked for the enemy. They worked for Rome. And what they had to do was bid on a certain territory, and when they got it, when their bid was chosen, they got it, every bit of taxes they collected went into their own pockets. And Rome would reinforce whatever they requested for them. They could count on Rome to help this happen, to enforce these outrageous amounts of money they were charging. And so they actually preyed upon the poor who had no recourse, really. Unlike the Pharisees, who were held in high esteem by the Jewish masses, the tax collectors, as you could imagine, were despised by the Jewish masses. Yet in this story you just heard, the respected and the admired Pharisee is seen seeking reward for himself, a reward he thinks he deserves. His prayer is really a testimony not to God, but to himself for all the good things he's done to earn God's good graces. While the tax collector, on the other hand, and quite dramatically different, realizes something absolutely essential that we cannot not realize. what was clear to the tax collector was that he was not God. He was not God. And he sees his nothingness, only his nothingness, before this one who is love, love itself. And it's clear to him that he falls short, far short of this great and one love. And all he has to rely on is the mercy of God, which is so freely given to him. His is the prayer of the humble, the little one, who takes on the attitude of simple and heartfelt gratitude because he sees the distinction between the unconditional and the limitless and his conditional and limited self. So it is the tax collector, the notorious and hated sinner, that Jesus declares is the one who gets it, who lives in the real world as Jesus understood the real world. He recognizes that littleness in himself before God and before his neighbor, before others. But the Pharisee didn't have a clue. He didn't know what was going on in this story himself. He could not see. He did not know that he was not worshiping God. He was really not worshiping God. He was worshiping himself. We're all here this morning, I'm convinced, we're quite convinced, we're here to worship God. We say to people, we say to ourselves, we're here to worship God. But are we really worshiping God? Or are we really worshiping ourselves? How do we know? How do we know who's really being worshiped here by each of us in our own hearts? How do we know if what we're worshiping here is truly God and not just ourselves? Well, I'd like to tell you at least how I know. But before I tell you, I'd actually like to show you. My pants are falling down. Are you seeing double? That's more like it. A little more honest, maybe, huh? Let me tell you how I know when I'm worshiping Gary instead of God. And maybe some of these things will fit for you as well. I'm really worshiping myself and not God when I put myself at the center of the universe, and I forget that there's only one who's at the center, and it ain't me. I worship myself when I think my needs somehow being met matter more than really anybody else's. And if my spouse or my friends or whomever, even my church or my leaders, do not meet my needs, all hell breaks loose. Really? I'm really worshiping myself when I'm so quick to tell you my story. And I don't ask you, I don't even ask you how you're doing. A lot of us are like that, sad to say. I'm worshiping Gary when my suffering matters more than anybody else's. I'm totally worshiping myself when I think I'm right. And I say everything with such conviction that people don't even have room to disagree. And when I don't change my mind, I admit that I was wrong. I'm worshiping Gary when I can dish it out, but I can't take it. I'm worshiping Gary when I cannot welcome healthy criticism, but actually get quite defensive when you criticize me. When I build my whole world and structure things, even in terms of my devotional life and my prayer life, to protect myself from my worst fears. I'm worshiping myself when I cannot live without being in control of you maybe even, but for sure myself and my emotions. I worship myself when I get so competitive that I need to win, or I need to dominate. I'm worshiping myself even here sometimes, when I use God. When I use God to make myself more secure, less afraid, and ward off evil spirits that I can't control. When I use God to bolster my ego and project onto God everything I think God should be like. I am worshiping myself when I think I am morally superior to any human being on this planet, no matter what they've done. And I worship myself when I can't forgive you, when I hold grudges or think you down. I worship Gary when I'm more worried about Gary's kingdom coming than God's kingdom coming. You see, all those are all symptoms of the truth that I put myself up there and not God. If you and I are ever to get ourselves off of our altars, we need to recognize clearly that we are not God. Human beings have been fighting that since the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve fought to replace God with themselves. It's the originating sin of all humanity that we want to be God in other people's lives and in our own eyes. We've got to come to grips not only with the limits of our physical beings, our physicality, limited all the time, mortal, but we also have to come to grips with the defects of our moral goodness. There's nobody here who has a pure, untarnished history. We all are. Our love has been tarnished so often. We're all, one way or another, morally tarnished. But that's not unfortunate, nor is it an embarrassment. It's not something to be embarrassed about. It's just the reality of who we are. And we need to accept that, and we need to bring it to that one essential prayer that we can't say enough. There is a God, and it ain't me. There is a God, and it ain't me. And I think I've told you this before, probably too often. But when I genuflect, and it's shaky-ish now when I genuflect because of post-surgery, my knee is so much stiffer than it used to be, but I think you can tell I'm trying to get back to it, wobbly as I am. But what I say to myself when I genuflect, which probably should be 24 hours a day, is that there's a God, and it ain't me. There's a God, and it ain't Gary. All I know is that that writer's dream was a revelation of sorts. And when she shared it, it stopped me short and brought me to my knees again, where I could say, even with my body, there's a God, and it ain't me. Because she was right. Her dream was right. When we put ourselves up here, we're just cannibalizing ourselves and feeding off our own undistinguishable spirituality. And we wonder why people don't want to be with us. Because who wants to be with a writhing little green, gray, slimy creature who's running out of love? When we put ourselves up here, it's just plain hell. And the only thing I know how to do is one choice at a time, is take myself, and perhaps you could take yourself as well, out of the way and make room for God. Make room for the one who is only love. And let God be God.